Some inherit land because it is valuable, but Ethan Calloway inherited land because it was still keeping a heartbeat his family had been too afraid to name. The rain began before sunrise on the morning he returned to Cedar Hollow, Missouri, falling in thin gray lines over the county cemetery, over the wet gravel lane, over the black umbrellas gathered beside his mother's grave. Margaret Calloway had always disliked fuss, so the service was small: a few neighbors from church, 2 women from the library where she had volunteered, an old attorney named Samuel Pike, and Ethan standing at the front with Mason pressed quietly against his leg. Ethan was 40 years old, a white veteran with a weathered face, short brown hair touched with gray, and the still posture of a man who had learned to hold himself together even when the inside of him felt hollow. He wore a faded canvas work coat over a plain flannel shirt, worn jeans darkened by rain at the cuffs, and sturdy work boots sinking slightly into the soft cemetery grass. Beside him stood Mason, his 6-year-old German shepherd, strong and athletic, with dark saddle markings, tan legs, upright ears, alert amber eyes, and a calm, loyal expression that seemed almost too steady for a morning like this. While the pastor spoke about mercy, memory, and the mystery of returning home, Ethan kept his eyes on the rain gathering along the edge of the casket. He had served overseas, repaired washed-out bridges, reinforced roads, read cracked concrete and shifting soil as if the earth itself could warn a man before giving way. Yet standing there in the Missouri rain, he could not read the silence his mother had left behind. Margaret had been careful with love, not cold, never cold, but guarded. She kept drawers locked, letters tied in ribbon, and certain family names folded away so completely that Ethan had grown up believing the Calloways were a line of quiet people who lost more than they explained. When the final prayer ended, the mourners touched his shoulder one by one and drifted toward their cars. Their tires hissed softly over the wet lane until only Ethan, Mason, and Samuel Pike remained. The cemetery sat on a low rise above town, and through the rain Ethan could see the familiar shapes of Cedar Hollow below: the brick courthouse, the feed store, the white church steeple, the water tower with flaking blue paint, and beyond it all the dark seam of woods leading toward Hollow Creek. Mason lifted his head toward that tree line and held still. Ethan noticed because Mason rarely looked at nothing. "You feel it too?" Ethan murmured. The dog did not bark. He only leaned against Ethan's knee, solid and warm, as if reminding him that grief was not meant to be carried without witness. Samuel Pike approached slowly, his hat beaded with rain, his gray suit protected by a long brown overcoat that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old paper. "Your mother asked that we meet at my office this afternoon," he said. "There are documents she wanted read immediately." Ethan nodded, too tired to be surprised. She did not have much left. Samuel looked toward the grave, then toward the woods. "Not much that most people would count." By 3 o'clock, the rain had turned steady and cold, tapping against the windows of Samuel Pike's law office above the pharmacy on Main Street. The room was narrow, lined with file cabinets, framed diplomas, and shelves full of county records whose leather spines had faded from red to brown. Ethan sat across from the desk with Mason lying beside his chair, paws crossed, eyes open. A ceramic lamp threw a circle of yellow light over the papers Samuel arranged with slow, respectful hands. Outside, cars passed through shallow puddles, and the pharmacy sign hummed below the floorboards. Samuel cleared his throat. "Margaret Calloway left you her personal effects, her savings account, and the Hollow Creek property." Ethan looked up. "Hollow Creek?" The name carried the smell of wet leaves and old warnings. He had heard it all his life, but rarely in full sentences. A farm at the end of County Road 16. Bad soil, people said. Too much limestone. Too much damp. A farmhouse nobody wanted to repair. Locals called it the sinking farm because after heavy rain, certain patches of ground sounded hollow underfoot, as though the earth had rooms beneath it. "I thought she sold that years ago." Samuel shook his head. "She never sold it. Paid the taxes every year." Quietly. He slid a folder across the desk. 118 acres, including the farmhouse, the well, the creek bottom, and the old north pasture. Ethan almost laughed, but the sound never left him. He had arrived in Cedar Hollow with 2 duffel bags in his truck, a service pension stretched thin, and no home he could honestly name. Now his mother had left him a farm the town treated like a bad memory. "Why?" he asked. Samuel did not answer immediately. Instead, he opened a drawer and removed a sealed envelope, cream-colored, with Ethan's name written in Margaret's careful hand. "She instructed me to give you this only after the will was read. And she was very clear about one thing. You are not to open it here." Ethan frowned. "Where, then?" Samuel's eyes moved to Mason. The dog had lifted his head, ears forward, as if the paper itself carried a sound. "On Hollow Creek land," Samuel said softly. "Your mother wrote that the letter would make no sense anywhere else." Ethan stared at the envelope. Rain traced silver lines down the office window. Somewhere below, the pharmacy doorbell rang and faded. "That sounds like her," he said, though it did not. Not really. Margaret had been practical, not dramatic. She stored batteries in labeled boxes, paid bills early, and corrected people who mistook superstition for faith. If she had made a request like this, it meant something. Samuel folded his hands over the folder. "There is one more instruction. If Mason stops at any place on that property and refuses to move, you are to trust the dog before you trust the ground." The words settled into the room with a quiet weight. Ethan looked down at Mason, whose amber eyes reflected the lamp like small watch fires. "Did she say why?" Samuel shook his head. "Only that some promises are kept below the surface." Ethan slipped the envelope into the inside pocket of his faded canvas coat. For the first time all day, the numbness inside him shifted. Not healed. Not lighter. Just disturbed, like still water touched by a stone. By late afternoon, he drove out of Cedar Hollow with Mason in the passenger seat, following County Road 16 past the last gas station, past fields shining with rain, past mailboxes leaning at odd angles along the ditch. The pavement narrowed, then gave way to red clay and gravel. Trees crowded closer. The sky hung low and bruised above the ridgeline. Mason sat upright, body calm but focused, nose tilted toward the cracked window. Ethan kept both hands on the wheel. Each mile seemed to pull him backward through time, toward stories his mother had never finished. At the rusted gate marked Callaway, he stopped. Beyond it, Hollow Creek Farm waited in the rain, tall grass, leaning fences, gray farmhouse, dark windows, an earth that seemed to breathe beneath the storm. Ethan cut the engine. For a moment neither man nor dog moved. Then Mason gave one soft sound from deep in his chest, not fear, not warning, but recognition. Ethan sat behind the wheel for nearly a minute, listening to the rain tick against the truck roof and the slow breath of the dog beside him. Hollow Creek Farm spread beyond the rusted gate like a memory that had been left outside too long. The pasture rolled low and uneven under a skin of wet grass. A line of split-rail fence leaned toward the earth in tired sections. Farther back, the farmhouse stood under 2 old sycamores, its gray boards darkened by weather, its porch sagging slightly at the corners, its windows reflecting the storm in dull silver panes. Nothing about it looked welcoming, and yet Ethan felt the strange pull of it before he ever opened the door. It was not nostalgia. He had only been here twice as a boy, both times from the road, both times with his mother gripping the steering wheel too tightly and saying they did not need to stop. Now the land was his, because she was gone, and that fact sat heavily in his chest. Mason gave another low sound, then pressed his nose against the passenger window. His upright ears did not soften. His amber eyes fixed on the farmhouse, then shifted past it toward the darker ground behind the kitchen wall. Ethan looked in the same direction but saw only rain, weeds, and the shadow of a stone well half swallowed by moss. "All right," he said quietly. "Let us see what she left us." He stepped out into the rain, pulled up the collar of his faded canvas work coat, and worked the chain from the gate. The metal was cold and slick in his hands. The gate opened with a tired groan that seemed to pass through the whole property. Mason jumped down from the truck and waited at Ethan's side, not running ahead, not sniffing aimlessly as most dogs would have done in a new place. He stood with the discipline of a working animal, watching, measuring, listening. Ethan drove the truck slowly up the rutted lane, tires slipping in the red clay. The closer he came to the farmhouse, the more details emerged: a mailbox hanging open, a rain barrel split down one side, white curtains yellowed behind glass, a porch swing suspended by one good chain and one new rope, as if someone had repaired it in secret and then stopped coming. That small detail troubled him more than the broken boards. Abandoned places decay evenly. This place had been neglected in front and tended in fragments, like a person hiding a wound under clean sleeves. He parked near the porch and turned off the engine. Rain filled the silence immediately. Mason stepped out first, his paws landing softly in the mud. He moved toward the front steps, then stopped, turned his head, and looked toward the back of the house. Ethan noticed the tension in the dog's shoulders. "Not the front door?" Mason did not answer, of course, but he started along the side path, nose low, tail steady. Ethan followed with the envelope inside his coat, feeling warmer than it should have. The path curved past a broken trellis and a patch of dead garden rose. Behind the farmhouse, the ground dipped toward Hollow Creek, which moved brown and swollen beyond the trees. Here the air felt different. Warmer. The rain steamed faintly where it struck a patch of bare earth near the kitchen wall, though the rest of the yard was cold enough to send a chill through Ethan's boots. Mason stopped on that patch and lowered his head. He did not bark. He simply listened. Ethan crouched beside him and set one gloved hand on the ground. Beneath the wet soil, there was a faint vibration. Not a machine, not running water, not the ordinary settling of an old house. It was too gentle for that, and too regular. A pulse, almost. Ethan pulled his hand back slowly. His training told him the soil might be hollow, that limestone country could hide sinkholes, old cellars, collapsed drainage channels. His heart told him something else. Some promises are kept below the surface. The words from Samuel Pike returned to him with the smell of old paper and rain. Ethan stood, wiped mud from his glove, and finally removed the envelope from inside his coat. The paper had stayed dry. His name rested on the front in Margaret's careful handwriting. For a moment, the sight of it nearly undid him. He could see her at the kitchen table of their old rental house, shoulders slightly bent, blue reading glasses low on her nose, writing each letter slowly because she believed names deserved care. He opened the envelope. Inside were 2 pages and a small brass key taped to the second sheet. The key was narrow, worn smooth at the bow, and tagged with a strip of cloth that had once been lavender. Ethan unfolded the letter while Mason remained over the warm ground, watchful as a sentinel. "My son," Margaret had written, "if you are reading this at Hollow Creek, then I have done the hardest thing a mother can do. I have left you with a truth instead of an explanation." Ethan swallowed and kept reading. She wrote that the farm had never been empty, not in the way people believed. She wrote that the town called it sinking because they did not know how to listen to what was underneath. She wrote that she had carried groceries, medicine, batteries, letters, and news through a hidden way for many years, and that age and illness had made the path too hard before she could prepare him properly. Ethan looked up from the page. Rain traced the side of his face like a cold finger. The land beneath Mason seemed to breathe again. He forced himself back to the letter. "Trust Mason before you trust the ground. He will hear what I can no longer show you. Your great-grandmother did not die in the way our family was told. She has waited beneath Hollow Creek because I promised her she would not be taken from the only place where she still felt safe. The world may call this impossible. I call it unfinished love." Ethan lowered the letter. The yard blurred for a moment, not from rain alone. He had grown up thinking Margaret was distant because grief had made her that way. Now he saw the outline of another life running beneath the one he knew, his mother driving out here with supplies, lying gently to neighbors, returning home tired, carrying a secret so large it must have bent every ordinary day around it. Mason suddenly lifted his head and walked toward the back door. He stopped beside a narrow set of steps leading into a mudroom, then looked back at Ethan. There was no urgency in him, but there was no doubt either. Ethan folded the letter, placed it carefully back inside his coat, and climbed the steps. The back door was swollen from damp, but the old farmhouse key from Samuel's folder turned after 2 tries. The mudroom smelled of dust, wet wood, and canning jars. Ethan wiped his boots, more from habit than necessity, and entered the kitchen. The room was dim. A cast-iron stove sat cold against one wall. Cabinets hung slightly crooked. A round table stood beneath a window looking out at the warm patch of earth. On the counter rested a jar of dried lavender, its lid polished clean of dust. Ethan stared at it. Someone had been here recently enough to touch what mattered. Mason crossed the kitchen and went straight to the pantry door. He stood there, ears forward, nose almost touching the lower panel. Ethan opened it. Inside were empty shelves, a broom, old flour tins, and a smell that did not belong to decay, candle wax, clean cloth, and something faintly medicinal. Mason stepped in, lowered himself to the wooden floor, and placed one ear against the boards. Then he raised his right paw and scratched 3 times. Ethan held his breath. From somewhere below the pantry came a weak, measured knock in answer. Ethan did not move after the knock came. The sound was too gentle to frighten him, and too human to ignore. It rose through the pantry floorboards like a memory asking permission to enter the room. Mason kept his ear pressed to the wood, his body still, his strong shoulders outlined in the dim gray light from the kitchen window. Rain tapped the farmhouse roof with a steady patience, and somewhere beyond the back wall Hollow Creek moved through the trees, swollen and brown from the storm. Ethan lowered himself to one knee beside Mason and placed his palm on the floor. The boards were cool, worn smooth by years of footsteps, but beneath them came a faint warmth, a breath of air not strong enough to be a draft, not random enough to be nothing. He waited. Mason scratched 3 times again, slower now. 1, 2, 3. For a few seconds there was only rain. Then the answer came from below, weaker than before but clear. 3 soft taps. Ethan felt the sound travel through his hand and into his chest. Every practical part of him began taking inventory. Old farmhouse. Possible cellar. Hidden access. Unknown person below. Structural risk. Check the floor before adding weight. Keep the dog back if the boards shift. But beneath the training, beneath the soldier and the engineer, was a son holding his mother's letter in the pocket of his coat, hearing proof that she had spent years walking between the world above and the secret underneath. "Mason," he whispered. "Back." The German shepherd lifted his head but did not leave the pantry. He looked at Ethan with those alert amber eyes, calm and certain, then stepped backward just enough to give him room. Ethan stood and searched the shelves. Most were empty except for flour tins, old jars, a cracked mixing bowl, and a row of canned peaches so faded the labels had nearly turned white. At the back of the pantry, behind a tall wooden rack that looked built into the wall, he saw a seam where the floor met the baseboard. The paint there was thicker, brushed over too many times, but a narrow metal edge caught the flashlight beam. He moved the rack aside. It scraped the floor with a tired wooden groan, revealing a rectangular outline, nearly 3 feet long, hidden beneath layers of paint and dust. A hatch. Not a cellar door thrown together by farmers for storing potatoes. This had been built carefully, concealed deliberately, and maintained quietly. Ethan pulled the small brass key from Margaret's letter. The lavender cloth tied to it trembled slightly between his fingers. He found the keyhole under a round metal cap no bigger than a quarter, pressed the cap aside with his thumb, and slid the key in. It turned with surprising ease. A soft click answered, and Mason gave one quiet breath, almost like relief. Ethan looked down through the old house, through the rain, through all the years his mother had carried this alone. "Mom," he said softly, not knowing whether it was a question or an apology. He lifted the hatch. Warm air rose from below, carrying the smell he had noticed before: candle wax, clean cotton, damp limestone, lavender, old paper, and the faint medicinal scent of a place where someone had tried very hard to keep living carefully. The flashlight revealed a narrow set of stone steps descending into darkness. They were not broken. They were swept clean. On the right wall ran a handrail made from polished oak, smooth from use. Along the left side, a thin wire disappeared into the shadows, tied neatly with small ceramic clips. Ethan felt the back of his throat tighten. This was not a forgotten hole beneath a ruined farm. This was a passage someone had walked again and again. Mason approached the top step, sniffed, then looked back at Ethan. "Stay close," Ethan said, though it sounded foolish because Mason had never done anything else. He tested the first step with his boot, then the second. The stone held firm. He descended slowly, one hand on the rail, the other holding the flashlight low. Mason followed behind him, careful and steady, his claws clicking softly against the steps. With each foot downward, the sound of rain above faded, replaced by a hush that felt thick with years. Halfway down, Ethan stopped beside the first photograph on the wall. It had been sealed in plastic and pinned beneath a strip of cedar. A young Margaret stood in front of the farmhouse, perhaps 20 years old, smiling shyly beside a woman Ethan did not recognize. The older woman had pale eyes, sharp cheekbones, and one hand resting on Margaret's shoulder. On the bottom edge, written in blue ink, were the words Clara and Margaret, Hollow Creek, 1979. Ethan stared at the name. Clara Whitmore Calloway. His great-grandmother. The woman his mother had once said was gone before Ethan was born. His fingers hovered near the photograph but did not touch it. "What did you do, Mom?" he breathed. Mason nudged his leg, not impatiently, but with purpose. Ethan continued down. At the bottom, the passage leveled into a narrow limestone corridor tall enough for him to stand if he lowered his head slightly. The walls had been reinforced with timber braces, each one marked with dates in pencil. Some were old. Some were recent. A small shelf held batteries, folded cloths, a lantern, and a notebook labeled supplies in Margaret's handwriting. Ethan opened it with one hand and saw neat lists: soup, water filters, radio batteries, blood pressure tablets, tea, lavender soap, postage stamps, oatmeal, peppermint drops. His mother had not been visiting an empty farm. She had been keeping someone alive. Farther ahead, a thread of yellow light glowed beneath a hanging curtain. Mason moved toward it, then paused and lowered his head, his tail still. Ethan's heart began to pound, not with panic but with the impossible nearness of an answer. He stepped forward and heard a voice from beyond the curtain, thin but clear enough to stop him where he stood. "Margaret?" The name floated into the corridor with such hope that Ethan had to close his eyes. When he opened them, he gently pulled the curtain aside. The room beyond was small, warm, and astonishingly orderly. A braided rug covered the stone floor. Shelves held books, medicine bottles, folded quilts, jars of dried flowers, and stacks of letters tied with ribbon. A battery lantern sat on a table beside a radio, a glass of water, and a framed photograph of Margaret at different ages. In a rocking chair near the far wall sat an extremely old woman wrapped in a blue knitted shawl. Her body looked fragile, her hands thin as folded paper, but her pale eyes were awake and bright. She looked first at Mason. The dog stepped forward and sat before her as if reporting for duty. The woman smiled with trembling recognition, then lifted her gaze to Ethan's face. For a heartbeat, grief, time, and family all seemed to stand in the same room. "You are not Margaret," she whispered. Ethan removed his wet cap slowly, his voice barely more than breath. "No, ma'am. I am Ethan. Margaret was my mother." The woman's eyes filled, but she did not look surprised. She reached one hand toward Mason, and he gently placed his head beneath her fingers. "Then she finally kept her promise," Clara Whitmore Calloway said. "She sent you before the rain took the old path." Clara's words settled into the little underground room with the softness of dust falling through lamplight, and for a moment Ethan could not answer. He had heard men speak across radios in storms, through static, through walls, through distances that made every syllable feel borrowed from fate, but he had never heard anything like this, his great-grandmother saying his mother's name as if Margaret had only stepped out for groceries and might return any minute with rain on her coat. Mason remained beside the rocking chair, his broad head resting lightly beneath Clara's thin hand. The German shepherd's alert amber eyes had softened, but his body stayed steady, as though he understood that this room held someone fragile enough to require both gentleness and guard. Ethan lowered himself slowly onto the edge of a wooden stool near the table, careful not to startle her, careful not to crowd the truth before it was ready to stand. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, because great-grandmother felt too large and too impossible to speak yet. Clara smiled faintly. "Clara will do. I have been Mrs. Calloway longer than most people have been alive." Her voice was thin, but there was dry humor in it, a small flame still burning in a very old lantern. Ethan looked around the room again, trying to make sense of the evidence before him. A quilt folded with military precision. A radio with fresh batteries beside it. A shelf of canned soup, oatmeal, tea, and peppermint drops. A wall of photographs arranged by decade, Margaret as a girl with missing front teeth, Margaret in a graduation gown, Margaret holding a baby Ethan on the front porch of a house he barely remembered. His own life had been down here, watched over by a woman he had been told was gone before he was born. The thought made the room tilt slightly. Clara noticed. "Sit back before you fall over, child." Ethan almost laughed at being called child by someone who looked older than the century itself, but he obeyed. "My mother came here," he said. "All these years." Clara's fingers moved gently over Mason's fur. "Every Tuesday, most Fridays, and on storm nights when the creek rose. She would scold me for using too much lamp oil, then bring me pie from the church suppers she claimed she did not enjoy." Her eyes moved toward the photographs. "She was a better daughter than she believed, and a better keeper of promises than I deserved." Rain whispered somewhere above them, muted by earth and stone. Ethan leaned forward. "Why was I told you died?" Clara's hand stilled on Mason's head. The question did not frighten her, but it did make the little room feel older. She looked toward the curtain, as though memory stood just beyond it, waiting to be invited in. "Because it was easier for the family to say I was dead than to explain why I disappeared." Ethan waited. He knew enough about pain not to rush it. Clara drew a slow breath. "I was born Clara Whitmore, long before the highway came through, long before Cedar Hollow had more than one doctor and 2 paved streets. This farm belonged to my father, then to me, and then to the Calloway line after I married. Hollow Creek was never rich land, but it was ours. It had springs under it, limestone rooms, old root cellars, places where the ground stayed warm even in January. My husband understood that land. Your great-grandfather, Henry, could find water with nothing but a willow branch and patience." She paused, her pale eyes bright in the yellow lantern light. "But families can be kind to strangers and hard on their own. After Henry passed, there were disagreements. Not the sort people write honestly in letters. The sort they bury under words like concern and property, and what is best." Ethan felt his jaw tighten, but Clara lifted one finger. "Do not let your face turn to stone. I am not telling you this to make enemies of ghosts." He breathed out slowly. "Yes, ma'am." She nodded, satisfied. "There were relatives who thought I was no longer fit to decide for myself. I was grieving, stubborn, and too attached to this place for their comfort. They wanted the farm sold. They wanted me moved into a facility 2 counties away. I wanted neither. I wanted my husband's papers protected, my house left standing, and my own days spent where I could hear Hollow Creek after rain." She looked down at Mason. "So I came below for a few weeks, or so I told myself. This chamber was not made for hiding forever. Henry built it during the Cold War years, like many men did, though he made it better than most. Ventilation, spring water access, a pantry, a second exit through the old smokehouse, though that one collapsed years later. I had supplies. I had the stubborn pride of a woman who had outlived being ordered around. And then your grandmother found me." Ethan tried to follow the branches of the family tree. "Margaret's mother?" "Evelyn. She was not cruel. Only frightened. She told the others I had gone to stay with distant kin. Later, after illness took her, the story changed, as stories do when no one wants to admit the truth became inconvenient. By the time your mother was old enough to understand, she had already guessed I was here. Clara smiled, and this time it trembled. Margaret was 14 when she first brought me a basket of biscuits and a flashlight. She said, "Grandma Clara, if you are going to haunt the farm, you might as well eat something warm." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. That sounded like his mother. Practical tenderness, hidden under a dry remark. The ache inside him shifted shape. Why did she never tell me? Clara's eyes filled with patience and sorrow. At first, because you were a child. Later, because you had your own burdens. Then you enlisted, and she told herself she would explain when you came home steady. But men do not always come home steady, Ethan. Sometimes they come home walking, speaking, working, and still carrying whether no one else can see. Ethan looked away, his throat tight. Mason turned his head toward him, ears soft, as if the dog felt the change in his breathing. Clara continued gently. Margaret feared giving you one more impossible thing to carry. And then she grew sick. By the time she wanted to tell you, time had become a narrow hallway. The phrase struck Ethan with quiet force. He looked around the chamber again, at the narrow walls, the low ceiling, the careful evidence of survival. Were you safe down here? Clara considered the question honestly. Lonely sometimes. Afraid on bad nights. But safe? Yes, in the ways that mattered to me. Your mother made certain of that. Dr. Helen Avery came when needed, though she asked fewer questions than any doctor has a right to. Samuel Pike knew enough to keep the taxes clean and the deed untouched. A few people carried a corner of the secret. Margaret carried the weight. Ethan remembered Samuel's careful face, the way the old attorney had not looked surprised by the strange instructions. A slow understanding moved through him. This had not been madness. It had been a hidden network of loyalty, imperfect and heavy, but built around one old woman's wish to remain on her land. Clara shifted in her chair, and Ethan stood at once. Do you need anything? She waved him off, but her hand trembled. I need to see the sky again before this rain steals the lower path. That is why she sent you now. Ethan glanced toward the curtain, the corridor, the stone steps behind them. Can you climb? Clara gave him a look that belonged to every stubborn Calloway who had ever lived. Slowly, with help, and with that handsome dog supervising. Mason's tail moved once against the rug. Ethan felt something almost like a smile touch his face. It did not last long, but it was real. I should call Dr. Avery first. Clara nodded. Yes. Helen will fuss. Let her. It makes her feel useful. Ethan reached for his phone, but there was no signal beneath the house. He would have to go back up. The thought of leaving Clara, even for a few minutes, felt wrong after finding her, but she seemed to read that too. I have waited longer than you can imagine, she said softly. I can wait while you climb a staircase. Ethan knelt beside Mason and touched the dog's neck. Stay with her. Mason settled at Clara's feet without hesitation, as if the order matched what he had already decided. Ethan rose and moved toward the curtain, then stopped. Clara, he said, the name still new in his mouth. Did my mother know I would come? Clara's eyes went to the photograph of Margaret holding baby Ethan. She hoped you would. Hope was her way of praying when words failed. Ethan carried that answer with him up the narrow corridor, past the photographs, past the supply notebook in Margaret's handwriting, up the swept stone steps toward the pantry floor. When he opened the hatch, the farmhouse kitchen waited above him in dim rain light, ordinary and impossible at once. He climbed out slowly, stood in the pantry, and listened to the rain on the roof, the creak beyond the walls, the warm breath of the hidden place below. For the first time since the funeral, Ethan did not feel that his mother had left him. He felt that she had handed him the end of a thread, trusting him to follow it back to the living. Ethan stepped into the farmhouse kitchen with rain sliding down the windows and the open pantry hatch breathing warm air at his back. For several seconds he simply stood there, phone in hand, staring at the room his mother had crossed countless times without ever letting him see the road beneath her feet. The round table, the cold cast-iron stove, the jar of dried lavender on the counter, the crooked cabinets, even the worn place in the floorboards near the pantry all seemed to carry Margaret's quiet fingerprints. She had not been distant because she loved less. She had been divided between two worlds, one above ground where neighbors saw her buying groceries and paying bills, and one below where an old woman waited for medicine, letters, batteries, and the sound of familiar footsteps. Ethan moved to the back door and lifted the phone toward the window. No service. He crossed into the parlor, then the front porch, where the rain fell harder and the fields beyond the leaning fence looked blurred and endless. One bar appeared, faded, returned, and disappeared. He stepped off the porch into the wet yard, boots sinking into red clay, and walked toward the rusted gate until the phone finally caught a signal. His first call was to Samuel Pike. The old attorney answered on the second ring, and before Ethan could explain, Samuel said, "You found the lower rooms." Ethan closed his eyes, letting rain strike the brim of his cap. "You knew." "I knew enough to keep the deed intact. Your mother would not allow more than that." Samuel's voice carried no defensiveness, only age and regret. "Is Clara alive?" The question made Ethan turn back toward the house, where the pantry window glowed faintly behind rain-streaked glass. "Yes. She is weak, but clear. She wants Dr. Avery." Samuel exhaled, a sound that seemed to carry years out of him. "I will call Helen. Stay there. Do not try to move Clara until she arrives. The old smokehouse exit has not been safe in years, and the pantry stairs are narrow." Ethan looked toward the back field, where the rain gathered in shallow silver pools. "The path below may flood. Then we will come quickly." The call ended, and Ethan stood alone in the rain, the phone heavy in his hand. He had expected anger to rise in him, anger at being kept outside the truth, at losing years with someone whose blood ran in his own veins, at his mother leaving him with the secret only after she could no longer answer for it. But anger did not come cleanly. It tangled with compassion. He imagined Margaret at 14 carrying biscuits into the dark. Margaret at 30 bringing baby photos to a woman the family had erased. Margaret at 60, tired and ill, still driving out to Hollow Creek with medicine tucked under a sack of groceries. Some burdens looked like silence from the outside because no one saw the love inside them. Ethan returned to the house, wiping mud from his boots before stepping into the kitchen. The habit felt absurd, then sacred. Mason was still below with Clara. Ethan could hear nothing from the pantry except the faint hum of hidden warmth rising from the opening. He took the lantern from the counter, found extra batteries in a drawer exactly where Margaret would have labeled them, and descended the stone steps again. The corridor seemed different now that he knew it had a living history. The photographs on the wall were no longer clues. They were witnesses. He passed Margaret as a girl, Margaret as a young woman, Margaret holding him as a baby, and finally a photo he had missed before, his mother standing beside Clara only 5 years earlier, both of them older, both smiling faintly, a German shepherd-shaped shadow visible near the bottom edge of the picture. When Ethan entered the room, Clara was speaking softly to Mason. "Your ears are better than Henry's old hound," and he could hear rabbits thinking. Mason rested his head near her slippered feet, accepting the compliment with solemn dignity. Clara looked up. "Helen is coming? Samuel is calling her now." Ethan set the lantern on the table. "He told me not to move you yet. Samuel has waited half his life to give an order about this place." Clara's mouth twitched. "Let him enjoy it." Ethan sat on the stool, closer this time. The shock had not left him, but it had changed. It no longer stood between them like a wall. It sat beside them like another quiet relative. "Did you ever want to leave?" he asked. Clara looked toward the shelves of books and letters. "Wanting is a complicated word when you get old. I wanted sunlight. I wanted the creek. I wanted to sit under the sycamores. But I also wanted to choose where my life remained. For a long time, This was the only place where my choice was respected. She reached for a folded quilt on her lap, smoothing the edge. That may sound strange to a man used to open roads. Ethan shook his head. No. It does not. She studied him carefully. Margaret said you came home with quiet storms. Ethan looked down at his hands. The knuckles were scarred from work, the nails rimmed with soil from the hidden hatch. She saw more than I thought. Mothers often do. They just do not always know how to enter the room where their sons keep pain. The words were gentle, but they found him with unnerving accuracy. Ethan swallowed and looked away toward the wall of letters. I wish she had told me sooner. So did she. Clara's answer came without hesitation. But regret is not proof that love failed. Sometimes regret is what love leaves behind when time runs out. Above them, footsteps sounded in the pantry. Mason lifted his head. Ethan stood. A woman's voice called down, clear and brisk. Ethan Calloway, if you are down there, answer me before I start worrying aloud. Clara smiled. That is Helen. Ethan stepped into the corridor. We are here. Dr. Helen Avery descended carefully, one hand on the rail, carrying a medical bag that looked older than Ethan but better maintained. She was in her 70s, with silver hair tucked beneath a rain hood, practical shoes, and the focused eyes of someone who had spent decades entering rooms where people were scared and pretending not to be. Samuel Pike followed behind her, damp overcoat buttoned crookedly, worry written plainly across his face. When Helen saw Clara, her brisk expression softened into something almost daughterly. You stubborn old cedar root, she said. Clara lifted one hand. You are late. You are hidden under a farmhouse in a storm. I came as fast as manners allowed. No one laughed loudly, but the room warmed with the kind of humor that grows only between people who have survived many hard conversations. Helen checked Clara with practiced gentleness, pulse, breathing, temperature, blood pressure, eyes, hands. Ethan watched from the side, grateful for the ordinary rhythm of care. Samuel stood near the shelves, hat in both hands, looking at Clara as if seeing not a secret but a promise he had feared would outlive him. She can be moved, Helen finally said, but slowly, and only to the farmhouse for tonight. No long drive. No excitement. Clara raised her brows. I have just met my great-grandson after 40 years of family foolishness. Excitement seems unavoidable. Helen ignored that with professional grace. Ethan stepped forward. Tell me what to do. That was the sentence he trusted most in himself. Not speeches. Not explanations. Work. Helen gave instructions, and Ethan followed them. He wrapped Clara in the blue shawl and an extra quilt. Samuel carried the medical bag and cleared the pantry landing. Mason went first up the stairs, then turned at the top and waited, watching every step. Ethan supported Clara with careful strength, feeling how light she was, how fierce, how alive. The climb was slow. Clara paused twice, breathing hard but smiling when Mason touched his nose to her hand. At the pantry threshold, she stopped completely. Rain light filled the kitchen beyond, gray and silver and real. Clara looked at it as if it were a country she had dreamed of but never expected to enter again. Ethan did not hurry her. No one spoke. The house held its breath. Then Clara stepped onto the kitchen floor, and the hidden life of Hollow Creek rose into the world above, one fragile footstep at a time. Clara stood in the farmhouse kitchen with rain light on her face, and the whole room seemed to understand that something impossible had crossed its threshold. Ethan kept one steady hand beneath her elbow, while Dr. Helen Avery watched every breath with the sharp attention of a country doctor who trusted facts but had made room for miracles when facts arrived wearing strange clothes. Samuel Pike stood near the pantry door, his hat held against his chest, eyes lowered as if he were witnessing a prayer instead of an old woman stepping onto worn floorboards. Mason remained close to Clara's side, his strong German shepherd body angled between her and the open hatch, not blocking her, simply guarding the fragile bridge between the life below and the life above. Clara did not speak at first. Her pale eyes moved slowly across the kitchen, The cast iron stove, the jar of dried lavender, the round table, the window looking toward the sycamores, the rain-dark fields beyond. Her hand trembled once against Ethan's sleeve. "Margaret kept the curtains," she whispered. Ethan looked at the yellowed fabric over the sink, something he would have thrown away without thinking. "She kept a lot," he said. Clara nodded, and in that small motion Ethan felt the weight of all the things his mother had preserved without explaining them. Helen guided Clara to the kitchen chair with gentle firmness, then wrapped another blanket around her shoulders. "You are staying right here for now," she said. "No long walks, no emotional speeches, and no arguing with the doctor." Clara gave her a tired look. "You have not improved with age." "Neither have you," Helen replied, and the two women smiled with the ease of old trust. Ethan found himself standing apart from them for a moment, watching the scene as if from the far end of a hallway. His mother's lawyer. His mother's doctor. His mother's secret. His mother's kitchen. And Clara, alive at the table, touching the wood with the fingertips of someone returning to a country she had never stopped loving. The rain outside softened, no longer drumming but whispering. Samuel cleared his throat. "There are matters we will need to handle carefully." Clara turned toward him. "Samuel, I have been hidden under limestone longer than you have been gray." "Say what you mean." He smiled sadly. "People will ask questions. Some will be kind. Some will be curious in ways that are less kind. We need to protect your privacy and make sure your wishes are respected." Ethan looked from Samuel to Helen. The practical world had entered the room, carrying forms, questions, proof of identity, medical concerns, explanations for neighbors, the long machinery of ordinary life. Just an hour earlier, Clara had been a voice beneath the pantry. Now she was a person the world would have to make room for again. Helen set her medical bag on the counter. "For tonight, we keep this small. Ethan stays here. Samuel calls no one except who is necessary. I will return in the morning with equipment, and arrange proper care without turning this farm into a sideshow." Mason gave a soft huff, as if approving the plan. Clara lowered her hand to his head. "This one has sense." Ethan crouched near her chair so she would not have to lift her voice. "Do you want people to know?" Clara studied him for a long moment. "I want the truth to be handled with clean hands. I do not need spectacle. I do not need pity. I do not need people standing on my porch trying to decide whether I am sad enough or strange enough for their liking." Her voice thinned, but did not weaken. "I want Margaret remembered as faithful, not foolish. I want this land kept in the family. And I want to see the sycamores in daylight." Ethan felt those words settle in him like instructions written deeper than paper. "Then that is what we will do." Samuel opened the folder he had carried from his car. Inside were copies of the deed, tax records, and a sealed document Ethan had not seen. "Your mother prepared for this as much as she could. She signed a statement explaining that Clara lived by choice at Hollow Creek and that she provided care with Dr. Avery's knowledge. It is not perfect, but it gives us a foundation." Ethan looked at Helen. "You knew all along?" Helen met his eyes without flinching. "I knew Clara was alive. I knew Margaret was caring for her. I also knew Clara was clear-minded and choosing to remain here. A doctor does not always approve of every choice a patient makes, but respecting a person is not the same as abandoning them." Ethan absorbed that. The old anger tried to rise again, but it had nowhere simple to stand. Everyone in this room had carried part of a difficult mercy. Imperfect, perhaps. Heavy, certainly. But not careless. Clara touched the table. "There is a cedar box under the bench by the back window," she said. "Margaret meant for you to have it after I came up." Ethan found the bench in the mudroom and knelt beside it. Beneath folded feed sacks and an old quilt sat a cedar box no larger than a toolbox, its brass latch polished from use. He carried it to the kitchen table. Clara nodded for him to open it. Inside were letters tied in blue ribbon, family photographs, land papers, a small Bible with pressed violets between the pages, and a pocket watch with a cracked face. On top lay an envelope marked Ethan, in his mother's handwriting. He did not open it yet. His throat was already too full. Clara watched him with quiet tenderness. Your mother wrote that one on a good day. She wanted it to sound brave. Ethan ran his thumb over his name. She was brave. Yes, Clara said. But even brave women get tired. The sentence moved through him with more force than any accusation could have. He had remembered Margaret as guarded, private, sometimes unreachable. Now he saw her as tired in a way he had never been old enough or present enough to understand. She had been daughter, caretaker, keeper of land, keeper of secret, keeper of him. Helen checked her watch and began organizing the room for the night. Samuel brought in blankets from his car. Ethan found dry firewood stacked in a covered bin by the back door, another sign of Margaret's preparation, and lit the old stove until warmth spread through the kitchen. The farmhouse began to sound alive, the tick of heat in iron, the soft rustle of Clara's quilt, the clink of Helen's instruments, the murmur of Samuel making calls in the parlor, Mason's steady breathing by Clara's chair. Outside, the rain finally stopped. A pale break opened in the clouds over the west field. Clara turned toward the window. Help me see it, she said. Helen started to object, but Clara lifted one hand. The porch. Not the pasture. I am ancient, not reckless. Ethan and Helen exchanged a look, then carefully helped her stand. Mason rose at once. They moved slowly through the kitchen to the back door. Ethan opened it, and the smell of rain-washed earth entered the house, rich and clean, carrying the creek, the sycamores, the wet grass, and the long breath of Missouri evening. Clara stepped onto the porch with a blanket around her shoulders. The clouds had thinned just enough for a low band of sunlight to reach the fields. It touched the leaning fence, the mossy well, the tall grass, and the warm patch of ground behind the kitchen where Mason had first listened. Clara lifted her face to the light. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she smiled. Ethan stood beside her, one hand ready in case she needed support, though in that moment she seemed held by something larger than him. There it is, she whispered. Hollow Creek. Mason sat at her feet, looking out over the land with calm, loyal eyes. Ethan looked too, and for the first time the farm did not seem like a burden, a ruin, or a strange inheritance. It seemed like a wounded thing still willing to heal. Behind them, the kitchen glowed warm. Beneath them, the hidden rooms waited in silence. Ahead, the field shone under the last light of day. Ethan thought of his mother, of the thread she had placed in his hand, of the promise now rising into open air. He had come to Hollow Creek believing he had buried the last of his family that morning. By evening, the land had given one back. Night settled gently over Hollow Creek Farm, not with darkness alone, but with the kind of hush that follows a day too full for the heart to hold all at once. Dr. Helen Avery insisted that Clara sleep in the front room where the air was warm and the windows opened toward the sycamores. Samuel Pike drove back to town only after making Ethan promise to call if Clara's breathing changed, if the creek rose too high, or if anyone came down County Road 16 before morning. The old attorney stood on the porch for a long moment before leaving, looking at the farmhouse with rain shining on the brim of his hat. Your mother trusted the right man, he said. Ethan wanted to reject the words, to say he had only followed a dog and opened a door, but he was too tired to argue with kindness. She trusted Mason, he answered. Samuel looked down at the German shepherd standing beside Ethan, dark saddle markings still damp from the storm, upright ears catching every sound in the fields. Then she trusted well, he said, and stepped into the night. After Samuel's headlights disappeared beyond the leaning gate, the farmhouse felt larger. Not empty larger, but awakened. The old rooms creaked around Ethan as if stretching after a long sleep. In the front room, Clara rested on a narrow bed Helen had arranged near the window, wrapped in quilts from the cedar box. Mason lay on the rug beneath her hand, close enough that her fingers could find his fur whenever she stirred. Helen sat in a kitchen chair nearby, writing notes by lamplight with the stubborn focus of a woman who had no intention of leaving before dawn. Ethan moved quietly through the house, fixing what the evening revealed. He set a bucket under a slow drip in the mudroom, wedged a towel beneath the back door, checked the stove, cleared broken glass from a corner of the pantry, and covered the open hatch with a plank so no one would step wrong in the dark. Work steadied him. It always had. Every small repair gave his grief somewhere useful to go. Near midnight, Clara woke and asked for water. Ethan brought it before Helen could rise. Clara drank slowly, then looked past him toward the kitchen. "Did you open your mother's letter?" Ethan's hand went to the envelope in his pocket. He had been avoiding it, though he had carried it close for hours. "Not yet." Clara nodded as if she understood every reason. "Margaret wrote better when she was not being watched. She said the page listened without interrupting." Helen glanced up from her notes. "She was right about that." Ethan sat at the edge of the chair beside Clara's bed and opened the envelope carefully. The paper inside smelled faintly of cedar and lavender. Margaret's handwriting was steady at first, then less so toward the bottom of the page. "My Ethan," it began, "by the time you read this, you will know that I kept a room in my life locked from you. I have asked forgiveness for that in every prayer I knew how to say. I told myself I was protecting you, then I told myself I was protecting Clara, then I told myself there would be a better season for truth. Seasons passed. Truth waited." Ethan stopped, his eyes fixed on the words until they blurred. Mason lifted his head from the rug, watching him. Clara said nothing. The house seemed to lean closer. Ethan read on. "Your great-grandmother is not a shameful secret. She is a promise I did not know how to explain. She chose the lower rooms when the world above her became too loud with decisions made by other people. I kept her there because she was clear in her mind, because Helen agreed she understood her own wishes, because Samuel protected the land, and because sometimes love has to walk a narrow path between what is legal, what is merciful, and what the world will misunderstand. If I failed you, it was not because I loved you less. It was because I was afraid of handing you one more burden when you already carried so many." Ethan lowered the letter and stared toward the dark window. His reflection looked older than 40. Weathered face, short brown hair touched with gray, eyes shadowed by the long day. He thought of all the times he had judged his mother's silence as distance. All the years he had called less often than he should have because speaking with her made him feel like a boy standing outside a locked door. Now he saw that she had been on the other side of another door entirely, carrying soup, medicine, batteries, family photographs, and a love so practical it had disguised itself as secrecy. He continued, "Hollow Creek is yours now, not because land matters more than people, but because people need a place where memory can stand. Do not sell it quickly. Walk it first. Let Mason lead you where he needs to lead you. He hears what we miss. He will know which parts of this farm are safe, and which parts have been waiting too long. If Clara still wishes to see the sky, help her. If she wishes to remain, honor her. If she wishes to leave, go with her as far as she needs. And if you feel angry with me, let that anger sit beside the love. Both can be true." That was where Ethan had to stop. The sentence opened something in him, not violently, not suddenly, but like a window eased upward after years of being painted shut. Both can be true. He could be hurt and grateful. He could miss her and resent what she had hidden. He could love the mother who raised him and grieve the mother he was only meeting now through letters, pantry steps, and an old woman's memory. Clara watched him with wet eyes. "She loved you fiercely," she said. "She just loved quietly." Ethan folded the letter against his knee. "I thought quiet meant absence." Clara reached out, and he placed his hand in hers. Her fingers were thin, but the grip surprised him. "Sometimes quiet is where people put what is too sacred to risk saying poorly." The room stayed still after that, held by the low stove heat and the rain dripping from the eaves. Helen eventually rose and checked Clara again, then ordered Ethan to sleep in the kitchen for at least 2 hours. He obeyed because he had learned that wise women gave orders more efficiently than generals. He stretched out on the old braided rug near the stove with his coat as a pillow. Mason hesitated between him and Clara, then chose the doorway where he could see both. It was the most Mason thing he could have done. Just before dawn, Ethan woke to a pale blue light pressing against the windows and the sound of Mason standing. The dog did not bark. He walked to the back door, sniffed the air beneath it, then looked toward Ethan. Helen stirred in the front room. Clara's voice came softly from the bed. "The creek?" Ethan stood and opened the door. Morning mist lay over the fields, and Hollow Creek had risen during the night, spreading silver through the low grass behind the smokehouse. It had not reached the house, but the warm patch behind the kitchen steamed faintly. Near the old well, a section of earth had sunk several inches, revealing a dark gap where runoff had washed away the surface. Mason stepped onto the porch, body still and focused. Ethan understood at once. The lower rooms had not only been hidden. They were vulnerable. If the rain had lasted another day, the old path might have collapsed before Clara was found. Margaret had known. Mason had heard in time. Helen joined him at the doorway, her face grave. "We need to document the lower rooms and close off anything unsafe." Ethan nodded. "I can shore up the pantry access and mark the sink areas. I will need lumber, gravel, maybe a pump if water gets into the corridor." Helen studied him. "You sound like you are staying." Ethan looked out over the farm, the leaning fence, the sycamores, the gray fields brightening under dawn, the house that had held grief above and life below. Clara's voice came from behind them, fragile but clear. "He has not walked the land yet." Ethan turned. Clara was awake, watching him from her bed. Mason moved to her side, and she rested her hand on his head. Ethan thought of Margaret's letter, of Samuel's trust, of Helen's steady care, of Clara's first step into rainlight. He had arrived believing Hollow Creek was an inheritance of trouble. Now it felt like unfinished work, and Ethan had always understood work better than despair. "Then I will walk it," he said. Outside, the first sunlight broke over the ridge and touched the wet pasture. The ground still steamed in places, still hollow in places, still holding secrets in its old limestone chest. But the silence had changed. It was no longer hiding Clara. It was waiting for Ethan to learn how to listen. By mid-morning, the storm had moved east, leaving Hollow Creek Farm washed clean and strangely bright beneath a sky the color of pale tin. Ethan walked the land with Mason at his side while Dr. Helen Avery stayed in the farmhouse with Clara, and Samuel Pike returned from town carrying lumber, caution tape, a thermos of coffee, and 3 legal pads full of questions. The fields were soft under Ethan's boots, the red Missouri clay holding every footprint as if the earth had decided to keep a record of who finally came back. Mason moved with slow purpose, not chasing scents, not wandering, but tracing the shape of the farm the way Ethan might have studied a bridge after a flood. Behind the kitchen, the warm patch still steamed faintly. Near the old well, the sink area had widened, exposing limestone beneath the grass. Beyond the smokehouse, Ethan found the collapsed outline of a second passage Clara had mentioned, half filled with mud and roots, too narrow and unstable to use, but important enough to mark. He drove stakes into the ground, tied bright cloth between them, and made notes on a damp scrap of cardboard when paper would not hold up in the wet. Work steadied him, but it no longer numbed him. Every measurement felt connected to a person now. Every hollow place beneath the farm had held a choice, a fear, a promise, a Tuesday basket carried by Margaret's tired hands. Mason stopped near the sycamores and lowered his nose to a mound of grass. Ethan crouched beside him and saw a flat stone nearly buried in moss. He brushed it clean with his glove. The carved letters were worn but readable. H.C. 1962. Henry Calloway. Clara's husband. Not a grave, Ethan realized after a moment, but a marker, perhaps placed over a spring line or a passage brace. He rested his hand on the stone and felt the coolness of it, the quiet intention. Henry had built the lower rooms not as a prison, not as a trick, but as shelter in an uncertain time. Clara had later turned that shelter into a boundary the world above could not cross without permission. The story was not simple. That was what made it human. When Ethan returned to the farmhouse, Samuel was standing in the kitchen with his coat off, sleeves rolled up, studying the pantry hatch as if it were both a legal problem and a moral one. Helen's medical bag sat open on the table. Clara was in the front room, propped against pillows, the blue shawl around her shoulders, sunlight touching the side of her face. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were alert, following the sounds of the house with the wonder of someone relearning its surface. Mason went to her first, as he always did now, and she placed her hand on his head without looking, trusting his arrival by feel. "What did the land tell you?" she asked Ethan. "The smokehouse exit is not safe. The ground near the well is sinking. The pantry stairs are solid for now, but I need to brace the frame and pump any water out of the lower corridor before the next rain." Clara nodded. Henry always said water was honest. It goes where the truth already made room. Samuel sat at the edge of a chair with a legal pad on his knee. "Clara, we need to discuss what happens next. Your identity documents can be reconstructed. Dr. Avery has medical records. Margaret's statement helps. But once we file anything official, people in town will hear some version of it." Clara looked toward the window, where the sycamores stood silver and bare beyond the glass. "Then let them hear a truthful version." Ethan glanced at her. "Are you sure?" "No," she said, and then smiled faintly. "But being sure has never been required for being brave." Helen made a small approving sound from the kitchen. Samuel lowered his pen. "What do you want said?" Clara took a long breath. "That I am alive. That I remained at Hollow Creek by my own choice. That Margaret cared for me faithfully. That no one is to turn my life into town gossip if they value my opinion of them." Ethan almost smiled. Samuel actually did. "I may soften the last sentence. Do not soften it too much. The first visitors came that afternoon, though not the curious crowd Ethan had feared. Samuel brought only 2 people at Clara's request, Pastor Ben Wilkes from the white church in town and Lydia Monroe, the county clerk, a quiet woman in her 50s who had known Margaret through the library. They entered the farmhouse gently, as if stepping into a room where a baby had just fallen asleep. Clara received them from the front room chair Ethan had moved near the window. The sunlight was warmer there, and she had insisted on seeing the sycamores while speaking to anyone who claimed to know Cedar Hollow. Pastor Ben removed his hat and stood silent for several seconds before saying, "Miss Clara, I do not know what to say except welcome back to the light." Clara's mouth trembled. "That will do, Pastor." Lydia Monroe carried a folder and a box of tissues she pretended were for everyone else. She checked documents, asked careful questions, and wept only once, when Clara identified an old photograph of Margaret at age 14 holding a biscuit basket in the rain. "She never told us," Lydia whispered. Clara's eyes softened. "She told you in the way she could. You just thought she was bringing extra groceries to an empty farm." Lydia pressed a hand to her mouth, and Ethan looked down, understanding again how many kinds of language kindness could use. By evening, Samuel had enough to begin the formal process without exposing Clara to spectacle. Helen arranged for medical equipment to be delivered discreetly the next morning. Pastor Ben promised to speak to the church board about privacy before rumor found its boots. Lydia promised to locate old records under both Whitmore and Calloway. The world above was beginning to organize itself around Clara, cautiously, imperfectly, but with respect. Ethan spent the rest of the afternoon reinforcing the pantry hatch. He cut lumber from an old stack in the barn, measured braces, set screws, and built a temporary railing down the first 6 steps. His movements were sure, almost meditative. Mason watched from the kitchen doorway until Clara called him back, and he obeyed with the solemn patience of a dog who understood he had 2 jobs now. As Ethan worked, he found pencil marks on the inside of the hatch frame, small dates written in Margaret's hand. Some were only months old. One read February 12th, fixed hinge before ice. Another read October 3rd, Clara laughed today. Ethan paused with the screwdriver in his hand. That second note undid him more than the will, more than the hidden room, more than the impossible knock beneath the floor. His mother had written down laughter as if it were maintenance, as if joy were something worth recording alongside hinges and batteries. He touched the words gently, then kept working. Near sunset, Clara asked to sit on the back porch again. Helen allowed 10 minutes with 2 blankets and no argument. Ethan helped her through the kitchen while Mason walked ahead, then waited at the threshold. Outside, the fields glowed amber. The creek had settled into a steady murmur. The marked sink areas fluttered with strips of bright cloth, but beyond them the farm looked almost peaceful. Samuel stood by the rail with a mug of coffee. Pastor Ben and Lydia had gone. Helen watched from the doorway. Clara sat in the chair Ethan had carried out for her and looked across Hollow Creek as if reading a book whose pages had been closed for many years. "Tomorrow," she said, "I want to see Henry's stone." Ethan nodded. "I found it near the sycamores." "He said you would." Ethan turned to her. "Henry knew about me?" Clara smiled toward the last light. "Not you by name. But he believed the family would one day need someone who understood structures, water, and quiet places. He prayed for that person before your mother was grown." Ethan felt the evening move around him, cool and clean. He had spent so long thinking his life had drifted away from meaning, that his skills were only remnants of service, that his quietness was something broken in him. Now an old prayer, spoken before he existed, seemed to have reached forward through wood, stone, rain, and a loyal dog to place him exactly where he was needed. Mason rested his head on Clara's knee. She stroked his ears and looked at Ethan. "Your mother did not leave you a burden," she said. "She left you the place where all of us were waiting to be forgiven." Ethan looked out over the farm, at the sycamores, the well, the fields, the house glowing behind them, and the strips of cloth marking fragile ground. For the first time, he understood that healing did not mean the past had been simple. It meant the past no longer had to stay buried to be loved. The next morning opened softly over Hollow Creek, with sunlight spreading through the sycamores and turning the wet grass silver at the edges. Ethan woke in the kitchen to the smell of coffee, stove heat, and fresh rain drifting through a cracked window. For one quiet second, before memory returned, he thought he was a boy again in some borrowed summer, listening for his mother's footsteps in another room. Then Mason lifted his head from the doorway, Clara coughed softly in the front room, and the truth of the farm settled around him with a gentleness he had not expected. Margaret was gone. Clara was alive. The land was his now, but not in the way a person owns a thing. Hollow Creek had received him like unfinished work, like a family Bible with pages stuck together by time, waiting for patient hands. Dr. Helen Avery arrived before 8 with a county health aide, a collapsible walker, and enough practical authority to make even Samuel Pike stand straighter when he came in carrying breakfast biscuits from town. Clara was sitting by the window in her blue shawl, her pale eyes fixed on the fields as if the morning itself were a visitor she did not want to miss. Mason lay beside her chair, strong athletic body relaxed but watchful, dark saddle markings warmed by the stripe of sun across the floor. When Ethan entered, Clara looked him over with the directness of a woman who had survived too long to waste words. "You slept badly." Ethan poured coffee into a chipped mug. "I slept." "That is not the same thing." Helen glanced up from checking Clara's pulse. "She is right, but do not encourage her." For the first time since the funeral, Ethan almost laughed without pain attached to it. After breakfast, Clara asked to see Henry's stone. Helen objected for exactly 3 minutes, then surrendered under the combined pressure of Clara's stare, Ethan's promise to move slowly, and Mason's quiet presence by the door. They wrapped Clara in 2 blankets, placed her hand on the walker, and crossed the back porch into the clean morning air. Every step took time. Ethan walked on one side, Helen on the other, while Mason moved ahead and then circled back, checking the ground as if the whole farm had become his responsibility. Samuel followed with a folding chair under one arm, pretending he was not emotional by adjusting his glasses too often. The marked sink areas fluttered with strips of cloth, but the route to the sycamores was safe. Near the mossy stone, Ethan brushed away wet leaves and helped Clara sit. She leaned forward, touching the carved initials with 2 trembling fingers. H.C. 1962. Her eyes closed. "Hello, Henry," she whispered. No one interrupted her. Hollow Creek murmured beyond the trees. A cardinal called once from the fence line. The wind moved through the sycamores with the dry, papery sound of old letters being unfolded. Clara sat there for a long while, and Ethan understood that some reunions do not need bodies on both sides. Sometimes love waits in places, in initials cut into stone, in land that remembers the weight of footsteps. When Clara finally opened her eyes, she looked at Ethan. He would have liked you. Ethan shook his head slightly. You do not know that. I know enough. He trusted quiet men who fix things before talking about them. Samuel cleared his throat and looked away toward the creek. Helen busied herself with Clara's blanket. Mason sat beside the stone, ears upright, calm loyal expression turned toward the trees. That afternoon, Cedar Hollow began to learn the truth in the careful way Clara had requested. Pastor Ben spoke only to the church elders first. Lydia Monroe filed the necessary records without gossip. Samuel prepared a written statement in Clara's own words, and Ethan read it aloud to her twice before she approved every sentence. It did not paint the story as a scandal. It did not invite pity. It said that Clara Whitmore Calloway had remained at Hollow Creek by choice, that Margaret Calloway had cared for her faithfully, that the family asked for privacy, prayer, and practical help as the farm was made safe. To Ethan's surprise, most people honored it. The first person to come was Mrs. Dale from the library, carrying a stack of books Margaret had once recommended. Then came 2 men from the church with lumber for the porch. A retired plumber checked the old pump. A neighbor Ethan barely remembered brought a casserole and said only, "Your mother helped me after my husband passed. I figured I could return 1 dish." Kindness arrived without ceremony, 1 truck, 1 toolbox, 1 covered plate at a time. Over the next weeks, Hollow Creek changed slowly. Ethan braced the pantry stairs and sealed the unstable passage near the smokehouse. He marked every sink-prone area, brought in gravel, repaired drainage around the kitchen wall, and built a safe ramp from the back porch so Clara could sit outside whenever the weather allowed. Helen arranged regular visits, though Clara insisted doctors were too fond of measuring things God had already counted. Samuel handled paperwork, identity records, land protections, and the delicate task of making sure nobody turned Clara's life into a county legend before she had a chance to simply live it. Mason became the farm's quiet guardian. He walked the boundaries every morning with Ethan, pausing where water moved underground, listening where the soil held a hollow note, returning to Clara's chair as if reporting what the land had said. Ethan opened Margaret's remaining letters 1 at a time, never more than 1 in a day. Some made him smile. Some made him sit very still. In one, she had written, "I hope the farm teaches you that staying is not the same as being trapped." That line stayed with him through April, when dogwood blossoms opened along the creek and the fields turned green. By May, he had decided not to sell. By June, he had moved his few belongings into the upstairs bedroom, painted the kitchen, repaired the porch swing, and planted lavender beneath the window because Clara said the house smelled too much like fresh lumber and not enough like memory. The town stopped calling it the sinking farm. At first, people simply said Hollow Creek. Then, after Pastor Ben used the phrase during Sunday prayer, some began calling it the Calloway place again. Ethan did not correct them. On a warm evening near the end of summer, Clara sat on the back porch under a quilt light enough for the season, watching fireflies lift from the grass. Her hair, thin and white, moved gently in the breeze. Mason lay at her feet, head resting on his paws, amber eyes half closed. Ethan stood at the rail he had rebuilt, looking across the fields toward Henry's Stone and the sycamores beyond it. The lower rooms were still there, clean now, reinforced, and no longer hidden. Clara had asked that one chamber be kept as a family archive, not for tourists, not for spectacle, but for the Calloways who would come after them and need to understand that love sometimes survives in strange architecture. In that room were Margaret's notebooks, Clara's letters, Henry's tools, photographs sealed in plastic, and the small brass key that had opened more than a hatch. It had opened a family. Clara broke the silence. "Your mother would like the lavender." Ethan nodded. "I hope so." She would also tell you the porch rail needs sanding. This time, Ethan laughed. A real laugh, quiet but whole. She probably would. Clara reached down and touched Mason's head. And she would thank him first. Mason opened one eye, as if he accepted the order of gratitude. The sun lowered behind the ridge, pouring honey-colored light over the fields, the well, the repaired porch, the open kitchen window, and the patch of earth where Mason had first heard the hidden knock. Ethan thought of the cemetery rain, the envelope, the pantry floor, Clara's voice calling for Margaret, and his mother's words about anger sitting beside love. Both were still there. So was grief. But grief no longer stood alone. It had neighbors now, purpose, forgiveness, work, laughter, and the steady breathing of a dog who had listened when the ground spoke. As evening settled over Hollow Creek, the farm grew quiet, not empty quiet, not secret quiet, but peaceful quiet. The kind that comes when a promise has finally been carried into the light. Ethan rested one hand on the porch rail and let the other fall to Mason's back. He had come home to bury his mother and settle an estate. Instead, he found a living root beneath the family tree, a story waiting below the floor, and a reason to stay where his name had begun. Sometimes grace does not arrive as an answer shouted from the sky. Sometimes it comes as rain on an old farmhouse, a key wrapped in lavender cloth, a great-grandmother's hand in daylight, and a German shepherd who knows that love, when buried deep enough, can still be heard.